The BBC has seen documents revealing that children and even babies were put into clinical trials for blood products in the 1970s and 80s, including ones known to have a high risk of contamination with HIV or hepatitis C. The children had blood clotting disorders such as haemophilia, and most have since died. Richard Warwick is an exception. He is now 58 and was at a special school called Trelaws from the age of 11 for the next 6 years. He now realises that the blood products he was regularly given were part of these trials.
In 1 month I had products given to me every single day for a whole month, which on its face doesn't sound a bad thing, but when you consider that you are exponentially compounding the risk of infection by giving a patient, in my case a young boy, large amounts of factor VIII was known to be contaminated. That's been known about since the 40s, the risks of using pooled blood and plasma products.
What were you told at the time?
Nothing.
But you weren't having regular bleeding episodes. The fact you were being given something every day for a month, all different products.
Yeah.
How was that explained?
It wasn't. They just said, we're going to put you on treatment every day. That was it. That's how it happened at school.
And this was being done to other children as well?
Yes, it was. There were cohorts. We know now there were cohorts of children used in these trials, both the prophylaxis trials and in the early 1970s in the hepatitis B infectivity trials using previously untreated patients.
Did you start to see, Richard, people around you, friends, others, get sick?
Yes, we had 2 or 3 hepatitis B outbreaks at the school. I think I witnessed 2 of them. I did contract hepatitis B on one occasion, and typical symptoms are your eyes go yellow, you become jaundiced. But we were told there was nothing to worry about, it was just a side effect of the treatment.
It wasn't until the inquiry that you realised that what you'd been given was part of a clinical trial to which neither you nor your parents consented?
Indeed, yes. There was no consent given by either myself or by my parents. They were never informed. The only communication we had with the school and the haematologist at the school was the end-of-term report telling my haematologist or pupils' haematologists how many bleeds they'd had during the term.
How do you overall reflect on what you went through, Richard? Do you feel fortunate that you are one of the ones who survived all of this, or are you angry at ever being experimented on in this way?
I will forever feel survivor's guilt at losing so many close friends at school, either indirectly or later on. It's been a dreadful experience. I've tried to keep myself together as best I can. Luckily, I've got a loving wife, and we just try to get on with life the best we can. I hope that Sir Brian Langstaff's report, when it comes out, will lay blame on pharmaceutical companies initially, but every single cog in that wheel that got those products from the USA into the veins of children, not only at the school but around the country, they need to be held accountable. I mean, that's difficult, but when you see who's involved, the governments, the haematologists themselves that were treating the patients knew what the risks were, and yet they carried on doing it. It was just awful. We had blood taken sort of 3 times a week at the school. We thought nothing of it. We thought it was just part of just testing, but in fact what they were doing is they were checking to see if we'd been infected.
Richard Warwick, thank you very much. And listening to that is Edward Tuddenham, Emeritus Professor of Haemophilia at University College London. He was one of the UK's leading haemophilia doctors through the period when most victims were infected, and he later developed the synthetic version of factor VIII that is still in use today. Morning, Professor Tuddenham.
Good morning, Michelle.
Take us back to the time that Richard Warwick is telling us about. Were you aware that testing and trials were taking place in this way?
Yes, it was an attempt to gain as much information as we could from the treatments that were available to us, given to our patients. The publications at that time show a progression of understanding and improvement as the better heat treatments and other treatments were introduced that eventually completely inactivated the viruses that were of greatest concern, HIV and what we now call hepatitis C. So it was an effort that the profession was making to understand the risks and to understand better how to overcome them.
Are you saying you don't think there was anything wrong with it, given the circumstances at the time? There was no consent involved.
Indeed. Of course, there should have been consent, and hospitals by then, we're talking about the late 70s, early 80s, did have ethical practice committees, although they were much less formalised and procedures were much more sort of ad hoc. I noticed that in one of the papers that was published at that time by my former colleagues, the statement is made about a study in which patients were given a heat-treated concentrate, that the nature of the study and the reasons for wishing to use these products were explained in detail to all recipients and their verbal consent obtained. Now, we'd be much more detailed about that nowadays, and we would for sure record things. So it is stated in the papers published around the time that some process of informed consent was undertaken. However, we didn't truly know what the risks were, and therefore what we could tell the patients was constrained by the unknown unknowns of the day.
Yes, but even that is part of something you can make clear, and it doesn't seem there was any form of consent, verbal or otherwise, that was given to the families, or indeed the children themselves, those who are of the age of Richard Warwick. Once you get to a lack of consent, then you can't really call it proper trial or testing, can you? It's experimenting on human beings.
Yes, it is.
And how do you feel about that?
Well, looking back on what happened across the board, there were really tragic results. And the fact that these treatments were given without detailed consent being obtained from parents or from the young boys, and in some instances infants, is greatly to be regretted, and it's a lesson that we must look back on and be ever vigilant and learn from it.
Professor Edward Tuddenham, thank you very much.
And Luke O'Shea Phillips, who is 42 years old, has mild haemophilia, a blood clotting disorder that means he bruises and bleeds more easily than most. He caught the potentially lethal viral infection hepatitis C while being treated at the Middlesex Hospital in central London. It was administered because of a small cut to his mouth. He was aged 3. It was 1985. Documents seen by the BBC suggest that he was deliberately given a blood product which his doctors knew might be infected so that he could be enrolled in a clinical trial. And he wasn't the only one. Documents submitted to the inquiry into the medical scandal suggest there were many others infected as part of a trial or without their and their parents' knowledge, and many of them are now dead. Let us talk to Dame Diana Johnson, who's chair of the Home Affairs Committee of the House of Commons and leads the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. Dame Diana, good morning to you.
Good morning.
It just seems extraordinary that this entire scandal is just a list of horror stories, isn't it? But these latest documents to be revealed add a new dimension to it.
They certainly do, and it's truly shocking what happened to so many people, including children, over so many years. And I think what also brings into sharp kind of focus this story that you have this morning is that for so many years, for decades, the Department of Health was saying there was nothing to see, there was nothing to investigate, there was no reason for a public inquiry. And as you know, it took until 2017 and Theresa May announcing that public inquiry for us to actually now start to see the evidence of what was going on over so many years to so many people.
Yeah, and it's evidence that we have very much focused on the politicians at the time who could have done more, the officials who could have done more and should have blown the whistle and should have understood what was happening. It's quite something else to look at doctors engaging
Yes.
in what can only be described as unethical practices.
Absolutely, it's appalling, and that's why we very much hope that when Sir Brian Langstaff publishes his final report in May, in a few weeks' time, he's heard all this evidence, he's seen all these documents, and we're all very we're hopeful that he will be able to set out exactly what's happened and to set out very clearly what his view is about what happened. And it strikes me that a phrase that the former Bishop of Liverpool, Bishop James Jones, used about the patronising disposition of unaccountable power is very apt for the story you've got today, because this is about doctors misusing their power on children, not getting consent, putting children into clinical trials when it sounds from what's being put forward, there was no reason clinically for them to have the treatments that they received. This is really very worrying about the behaviour of doctors.
And you will know of reports, indeed you've almost certainly been involved with this yourself, of people now waiting for compensation and saying, hang on a second, why is it that there is so much concentration, rightful concentration on the post office scandal, but not on this scandal, and specifically not on the money side of it?
Absolutely. And Sir Brian Langstaff, I think he was so taken with what had happened to people that he said last April, a year ago, that compensation needed to be paid, not only for the infections and the consequences of the infections, but also, he said, for the wrongs done by authorities whose response served to compound suffering. So that decades-long nothing to see here, the failure to deal with the concerns that people had. So he said a year ago, a compensation body needed to be up and running by the end of last year and starting to pay out compensation. And the government have accepted the moral case for compensation. But the problem is that they keep dragging their feet. And whilst I welcome this week, they've put forward some amendments to the Victims and Prisoners Bill in the Lords, my big concern is how long it's going to take to get this body up and running and to start paying out, because we've already missed the deadline that Sir Brian set for the government for last year. And these people are dying. 2 people are dying really every week at the moment on average. So these people cannot wait. And that's why Sir Brian said last April, he in all conscience couldn't wait for the final report. He had to make clear to the government they should start taking action last April.
Okay, Dame Diana Johnson, thank you very much.